Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another session of Cyber Conversations. I'm Kanti. Today, I have with me a guest, Kim Crawly. Kim is a cybersecurity generalist who has a long history conducting cybersecurity writing and research for Tripwire, AT&T Cybersecurity, Kaspersky, BlackBerry Cylance, and Venafi. She also has contributed to Infosecurity Magazine, Threatpost, Comodo's blog, CCSI's blog, CSO, CIO, Computerworld, Hacker Noon, The Threat Report, and 2600 Magazine. Also helped Hack the Box launch their new blog and wrote some really great white papers for Synack. Kim also has an ongoing threat intel side gig. Kim, thank you so much for being on Cyber Conversations. The floor is now yours.
Oh, I'm honored to be here. Thank you, Kathy.
Could you share a little bit about your cybersecurity journey so far? Like, when did your interest in cybersecurity start, and what path you took to, to be this researcher and to be the cybersecurity writer?
Yeah, my childhood was like in the late 1980s and like throughout the 90s. So I got to see a much different world of computer technology than young people did today. Like young people today, you grow up with smartphones and the internet and there's Wi-Fi everywhere. And in the 90s, that wasn't the world that we lived in. In the 90s, computers seemed to be like a forbidden fruit to me. You would see there was personal computers. You would see personal computers around. The first personal computer I'd ever seen was a Commodore 64. And because this was like in the late 80s, and I wanted to touch it and play with it so badly. It fascinated me that you could hit the keys and it would change what you saw on the screen. And that Commodore 64 belonged to my much older half brother, and he didn't let me touch it. So from then on, I was determined to touch computers as much as I possibly could. My family got a Windows PC in the early 90s because of my dad. My dad worked from home. He was a writer. And he would let me use the computer when he wasn't using it. So that got me a lot more experience with using computers. And the first one that we had ran Windows 3.1. That is a very old version of Windows that existed in the early 90s. And then we got the internet for the first time in 1995. And going on the internet in the mid 90s, people didn't have Wi-Fi in their homes. Ethernet existed, but you usually saw that in workplaces, not in people's homes so much. And it was a big deal to go on the internet. There'd be like a dial-up modem. Our household was very lucky. We had like our very own dedicated phone line just for the internet. Other households that didn't have that, their phone line was tied up when they went on the internet. So smartphones didn't really exist, and cell phones were very large and clunky and expensive. People in the early 90s, mid 90s, would not be using their huge, heavy cell phones to access the internet. And so it was a completely different world technology wise. My access to the internet was limited and it was special. And the World Wide Web was brand new. Like the World Wide Web started to become a thing about the end of 1991, early 1992. That's how old the web is. And that's only one part of the internet. The internet is considered to have been born in 1983. So a lot of these technologies had to spend a lot of time evolving to get to where they are now. I did not consider computers to be a career for me, though, because I was in middle school at the time, and my math grades were really bad, partly because I had undiagnosed learning issues. And my teacher at the time, I was in grade 4, grade 5, which is Canadian speak for 4th grade, 5th grade. And she told me, Kimberly, if you want to work with computers one day, you have to be a math genius. And instead, I wasn't bad at math because I wasn't motivated enough to be good at math. I had learning difficulties that weren't diagnosed yet. So I just gave up on the whole idea of ever working with computers. And it was already an uphill battle because in the 90s, if you watched TV and movies, the computer geniuses were always men. So I didn't consider a career with computers again until I was like in my mid-20s. And that was only because everyone around me kind of nudged me in that direction. The work I do with computers, though, is very unusual. Most people who work with computers are technicians who facilitate the operation of computers. They're administrators who have authority in computer networks and computer applications and make everyday operational decisions. And there are computer programmers and software developers who create and maintain the software that we use every day on our computers and on the internet. My job is very unusual. I don't really do any of those things. I just write about the bad things that happen with computers. So when a bad thing happens with computers and it's deliberate, we call that a cyber attack. And that is something that I've been writing about professionally for the past 10, 15 years or so. One thing that wasn't in my bio is I've been working for a cybersecurity research firm called IOActive, which is based in Seattle. And they do really cool kinds of cybersecurity research. So they don't, most of the time they're not researching how, iPhones and MacBooks and stuff like that can be cyber attacked. They spend most of their time researching how the computers that are installed in the equipment in factories can be cyber attacked, or the computers that are a part of airplanes can be cyber attacked, and that sort of thing. So it can be really bad if you get really bad malware on your laptop and you can't boot into your operating system. But imagine a massive factory and every computer in that factory gets hit by malware, which means the factory has to shut down. That becomes a much bigger and much more expensive problem. So IOActive does research about how to make those kinds of very specialized computer systems more secure. So I don't really do any of their research. I more help people on the inside of that company communicate with each other. Pretty soon I'm going to start another job with another company, and I'm not going to name that company yet, but they also create new technology which helps the computers that big companies and big institutions and big enterprises use protect themselves from cyber attacks, partly from analyzing possible cyber attacks. There are all kinds of different types of technology that can be used to protect really big, expensive computer systems from cyber attack. There's monitoring with things like intrusion detection systems and intrusion prevention systems. And there's firewalls to filter the kind of network traffic that's going around the corporate network to make sure that there are no network communications that are potentially bad or harmful. There's all these devices on these networks, they generate logs. So a log is when something happens with a computer application or a computing device, and the nature of the event is recorded in an electronic record that keeps flowing through the system. So for instance, if someone in this enterprise network connects their smartphone to the company Wi-Fi, and the local wireless access point, like the wireless router, sees the connection, that could be an event on a log that is running on that wireless router, a new endpoint connected to this device. If someone on the company network shut down their laptop, that could be an event on the logs. If I was to use the company network to send a message directly from my phone to one of the servers that the company operates, that could be another event on the log. So all these computers on the enterprise network, they create logs, and each of these devices perhaps makes like 100 or 200 or 300 or more events on all the logs every single day. So if you multiply all the different devices on that network, and you think that each of those devices is creating, several hundred log events every day, you've got way more logs than any human being ever has time to look at. And the thing is, looking at those logs and what events are occurring in the network is one of the main ways that these companies determine if they're being cyber attacked or not. So if you can't have a human being sitting there watching all the logs that are being created all the time, then you have to create special types of computer technology to process these logs and for the computer to decide if something bad is happening or not. So we have devices called intrusion detection systems and intrusion prevention systems, and they can be programmed to look for what we call anomalies. Anomalies are things that happen that don't usually happen. And an anomaly could be an indication of a cyber attack. So a computer system could indicate that there's an anomaly, and then it's up to a human being to go and analyze that anomaly and see if it was just an ordinary, not normal thing that's no big deal, or if that normal thing is actually the sign of something bad happening. And then really big companies have things called security information and event management systems. So they are really sophisticated computer systems where all of these logs, even from the IDS and IPS devices and the network firewalls and all the servers and all the endpoints and all that kind of stuff in the network, they generate logs, and then the SIEM, the Security Information and Event Management System, is programmed with what people put into the SIEM that are called log correlation rules, or SIEM correlation rules. So for instance, if a company only has employees working normally between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m., someone in the company trying to do work on one of their computers at 8 p.m. could trigger an event in the SIEM, like this isn't normal, right? So it's up to human beings and intelligence from all these different cybersecurity companies to figure out what are signs that something bad could be happening. And so these systems are designed with information on how to determine if something's bad happening. And then it's up to a human being behind the software to be notified, and we call that an event alert, when something bad could be happening, but we don't know if something bad is happening until they go and they look to see if that thing that isn't normal is something bad happening or not. But all these, we call that automation. So all these computers are doing all the boring, tedious work, and it's only up to human beings now to look at the anomalies and see if something bad is happening or not. So it takes a lot of, it's not even humanly possible to look at every single little event when someone turns a computer or an application on and off and stuff like that. So where was I going with all this? So the company I'm going to start working with soon creates more technology that builds upon these systems. So companies have a better understanding of when something bad is happening so they can stop the bad thing from happening. So a cyber attack, a lot of the time it doesn't only take like 30 seconds. A cyber attack could be in a company's network for multiple minutes, multiple hours, sometimes even multiple days or longer. And we know that the earlier that the cybersecurity experts working for the company know that something as bad is happening so they can try and stop it, the less bad stuff happens, the less damage happens. So that's always the goal with these cybersecurity systems, is to detect the bad things that are happening as soon as possible, so as little bad is happening as possible. You can think of, for instance, if a robber breaks into a bank. If the robber isn't caught for an hour, the robber could be stealing millions of dollars out of that bank. But if the robber is caught within 5 minutes, they might only be able to steal some $1,000 from the bank. So the sooner that you catch these bad guys doing something bad, the less damage occurs. Really long-winded answer, but I spoke a lot of like really central concepts in today's enterprise security.
Thank you. Actually, that I think will help a lot of people understand what exactly security is and how security applies to all these companies. Because people, when they think of security or cybersecurity, we always know they look at the stereotype that is portrayed in the movies, in the TV shows, even in books, with the people that are able to get into systems in like minutes and say, oh, I'm in, I hacked, the traffic camera, I hacked into this database, which is supposed to be a very secure database, into the FBI's databases and stuff. So this, I think, will provide our audiences a lot of insight into what security actually is for companies. So thank you. That was fantastic.
Yeah.
I have a few questions about, writing and research and everything. So what actually inspired you to, pursue this writing path? You had mentioned, some struggles with math. Don't get me wrong, I had the same struggles with math. I do not like it. Um, so what exactly inspired you to pursue this writing track when it came to cybersecurity?
Yeah, my dad was a professional writer. My dad wrote fiction books. That was his job when I was a kid. So people don't usually think, like, people go to school and there's English class and there's math class and there's science class, and they don't normally think of things like science and English combining, right? So I didn't think of that when I was a kid. I didn't think that way either. My dad wrote fiction for a living, so he didn't write about real things. He wrote about the stories in his head. So my career path didn't even occur to me when I was a kid, but my writing was always encouraged. There was one thing in school that I was good at. My career very much exemplifies the idea that if your grades are best in English, that doesn't mean that you don't have a place in the tech industry. And I write a wide variety of different kinds of things. So I started by every tech company I've ever worked for has a blog on their website, and it's official blog for that company. And sometimes the bloggers write about news in the cybersecurity world, sometimes about cyber attacks, sometimes about new technologies that are coming about, and sometimes they write things about what the company is doing. So I spent years writing about cybersecurity news for a lot of tech companies on their websites, and that was what I was doing for several years. But that led to a lot of really interesting opportunities. So I co-wrote my first book in 2020, and it was titled The Pen Tester Blueprint. And the reason why I got the opportunity to co-write that book was because the book publisher, Wiley, gave a man named Philip Wiley the book deal to write the book on his own, because it was based on his own talks about how to pursue a career as a pen tester, which is someone who simulates cyber attacks in order to test the security of computer systems. And he couldn't finish the book on his own. He only had the book about half written. He wasn't an actual writer. He knew me from the community. He asked me to co-write the book so it could be finished for the publisher on time. And that's how I got started in writing books for a living. So the pen tester blueprint has done very well, and it's been a book that a lot of people have read when they've wanted to pursue a career as a pen tester. And that's another possible career path for you, is to be a pen tester. And that is the kind of stuff you see on TV. Someone pretending to be a bad guy hacker, simulating cyber attacks in order to see how secure insecure computer systems are. And I tell people the big difference between a cyber attack and a pen test is a cyber attack is usually against the law, and obviously the victim of the cyber attack does not consent to the cyber attack. A pen test or a penetration test is done with the full consent of the owner of the computer system. And in fact, as I've written in my books, you have to have a legal contract with the company that you're pen testing for that says that you have permission from them to do what you're going to be doing. Because if you don't have that legal contract, then you could be breaking the law. So yeah, so that got my foot in the door. And then I wrote a book on my own called 8 Steps to Better Security. And that was a book more for companies and businesses, for if they have no idea how to start with securing their own computer systems, my book would start covering the basics. And then this year has been really busy for me because I've written 2 books. So they're both coming out really soon. One of them is coming out, I believe, in November, and it's called Hacker Culture A to Z. So you see, not all hackers are bad. Some hackers are good. A lot of the computer technologies that we use every day were actually invented by hackers. So my definition of hacker is someone who finds new and inventive uses with technology. So that's why I usually call the bad guys cyber attackers, which is not a distinction that everyone makes. So anyway, hacker culture, in my mind, is the culture of computers and computing. So my book covers roughly almost 300 terms and concepts to do with hacker culture, the culture of computing. Everything from famous people like Bill Gates to famous companies like Apple to people that you've never heard of, and companies and universities and all kinds of things that you may have never heard of that played a pivotal role in the culture of computing that we have today. And the great thing about that book is you don't have to read it from front to back. You can read it in any order you want. So that's going to be a really fun book for people who are interested in that kind of thing. And that will be published in O'Reilly, by O'Reilly, next month at some point. And then when I was in the middle of writing that book, another company asked me to write a book for them. So the Hacker Culture A to Z book, that was my idea, and I gave the idea to O'Reilly. The other book I wrote this year, it was honestly not my idea, but I was asked to write it. So it's called Cloud Penetration Testing for Red Teamers. And a red team is a kind of offensive security team. And offensive security, pen testing and penetration testers and whatnot are a part of that. So it's simulating cyber attacks in order to test the security of computer systems. So a red team is a specialized way of doing that. So a lot of the computer networks that big companies and enterprises use these days aren't entirely or at all on their own premises. Now we have services like AWS and Azure and GCP. So companies can pay Amazon or Microsoft or Google to run their servers for them. And so my book is about how to simulate cyber attacks in companies' networks if they use those technologies. So unlike the first book, Cloud Penetration Testing for Red Teamers has a lot of step-by-step technical tutorials on how to simulate cyber attacks. And that should be coming out probably later November or December. So I'm going to be completely honest with you, after writing 2 books, very much both at the same time a lot of the time, I am absolutely exhausted from writing books, and I promised myself that I'm going to take at least a few months off from writing books. I was very lucky that my work for IOActive, which is mainly writing things inside the company, wasn't a lot of hours. I wasn't working like 40 hours a week for IOActive. So it gave me a lot of time to work on 2 books. But now I'm going to start with a new company soon. And this new company is going to have me write white papers and the company's blogs and any sort of writing that this tech company could possibly want. I'm going to be the one to do it. So I think when I start with this new company, at least at the beginning, when I get into the flow of things and understand what kind of work that I'm going to be doing for them, I'm not going to have any time to write books anyway. So being a writer can be like being a computer programmer sometimes. You have like big projects, and then sometimes you got a lull between projects, and then sometimes you're super busy. So yeah, you get to benefit from speaking with someone today who has a pretty unusual career in the tech industry. But it's great because it plays to my strengths as a writer and as a researcher.
That is actually fantastic. You answered 2 of my follow-ups as well. One was about the hacker culture book, and the other one was about the pentester blueprint. So you answered all questions together. That is super. And that is true. This is the first time I'm doing a conversation with somebody who's a writer in cybersecurity, as opposed to I've talked to, CISOs, I've talked to managers, I've talked to coders, but never someone whose strength lies in writing. So this is, I'm loving it. So my next question to you then is, as someone who's written for both technical and non-technical audiences, what strategies do you use to communicate complex cybersecurity concepts effectively?
Yeah, I've done that earlier in this conversation, right? Because only big fancy nerds use words like anomalies when it comes to computers, for instance, right? So that can be when we talk about big fancy words that are limited to certain professions, we usually call that jargon. So I kind of instinctively knew that the word anomaly when it comes to computers is jargon. So when you talk to people within your industry with your same profession, you can go ahead and talk in all the jargon that you possibly want. And the existence of jargon is very important because sometimes there are specialized concepts that you need to have specific words for. Like 2 physicists could have a really in-depth conversation with each other, and I didn't understand half of what they're saying because half of what they're saying is physics jargon, and I'm not a physicist, right? But they would not be able to have that conversation without the physics jargon. So when you communicate the same ideas to someone who doesn't have that expertise, it will take longer because you're going to have to define concepts for people. But the way I think of things, even the most complex concepts in cybersecurity have normal, everyday, practical equivalents. So a couple of cybersecurity people could say there's an anomaly in the network. But it's, if you think about what an anomaly in the network is, it's easy to explain it as something happened that doesn't normally happen. Something abnormal happened. And that's all the word anomaly means. A lot cyber attacks and cyber incidents are basically bad stuff happening with computers. If it's a cyber attack, it's deliberate, which means that there's a cyber attacker who wants to do some sort of bad stuff. But sometimes bad stuff happens with computers and there's no bad intention behind it. And it could be a cyber threat. So for instance, I could have data on my phone and I'm silly enough to have not backed that data up anywhere else, and I live on the 24th story of a building, if I was to drop my phone over the balcony, there's no way that my phone is going to survive that fall intact. If I didn't back up that crucial data somewhere else, then that might be computer data that I have lost forever by destroying my phone. So we could call that a cyber incident. Something bad happened to a computer, something bad happened to computer data. But I dropped my phone off the balcony accidentally, so it's not a cyber attack. But if some bad guy was on my balcony and if he grabbed the phone out of my hand and threw it off the balcony, yeah, technically speaking, we could consider that a cyber attack. So sometimes cyber attacks aren't the most obvious things that you see on TV and movies. You got to think holistically. It's anything bad that could be happening to computers and the data that's inside of them.
It's also the context of the event that matters there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You've spoken at SANS's Pen Test Hack Fest about writing reports and pen testing. So can you share some tips or best practices for, aspiring cybersecurity professionals when it comes to report writing? Like what aspects should they be focusing on? Like you had said earlier, we tech people, when we are writing technical reports, we have a tendency to use a lot of those techie words or that jargon. So what advice or what tips would you give to these people that are wanting to write technical reports?
Yeah, I have learned from being in the industry and knowing a lot of pen testers over the years that a lot of pen tests have not done much good for companies because the pen testers working on the pen test just weren't able to write an effective report. When people learn about pen testing, they focus all their energy on all their really advanced technical knowledge, and sometimes they forget about things like the purpose of a pen test is to communicate to these companies where their security vulnerabilities are, and you need to find security vulnerabilities that you can only find by simulating cyber attacks. But if you find a bunch of security vulnerabilities and you're not able to communicate what those vulnerabilities are and how they can be remediated, then that pen test was all for nothing. So this is another example how even if your strength is in English or in creative writing, there's a role for you in tech. And a pen tester report is an example of a type of writing that requires both being able to explain things to lay people and being able to explain things to technical people. So there are two types of people who read pen test reports. There's the actual technical staff in the company, and they need the technical language, and you won't be able to communicate your ideas about what's wrong without using technical language with them. But the other type of person who reads pen test report are corporate executives. And corporate executives, sometimes they can be computer nerds, like if they're a CISO or a CISO, which is a Chief Information Security Officer, or a CTO, a Chief Technical Officer, for instance. Those are the kinds of executives that you could use highly technical language with. But usually the financial decisions are made by people with titles like CEO and CFO, Chief Executive Officer, Chief Financial Officer. And those types of people usually don't understand technical language very well. And yet they make the decisions about how money in the company is going to be spent. So you have to convince them that money should be spent on improving the company's cybersecurity. And at the end of the day, these are the kinds of people who read the Wall Street Journal and Fortune Magazine and Forbes all the time. Their greatest interest, first and foremost, is money. not anything else. If there was a problem with the company's computers, but it didn't hurt their ability to make money, then they wouldn't care about it. So the beginning of a pen test report is what we call an executive summary. And it is literally what the executives read. And you have to assume that the executives reading that part are not technical, but are obsessed with money and will happily spend $1 million to avoid losing $100 million. But you're not going to convince them to spend $1 million otherwise. So the executive, no matter how much pen testing you did, or whether the overall report is 20 pages or 200 pages long, the executive summary can only be maybe 1 or 2 pages at most, because these big corporate executives are not going to sit through a 20-page pen test report or a 200-page pen test report. So I would say the first couple of pages is use less technical language, and you make it clear to them, if these problems don't get fixed, it's going to cost your company a lot of money. So that's the non-technical writing. So that's a lot of dollar figures and less technical jargon. And the rest of the report, you have to use technical jargon, because this is the information now that you're sharing with the IT department that works for the company. So you have to explain to them what security vulnerabilities you found, how you found them, how they're classified. There's something called triaging, where you order security vulnerabilities according to what are the most important to address now, and what are the ones that you can put on the back burner and address later. And it's impossible for any company to address all those vulnerabilities at the same time, because it's more work than they can do at any given time. So you have to prioritize. The most bad vulnerabilities go first, and the least bad vulnerabilities go last. And so that's called triaging. And hospitals also use that term, triaging. So if you go to the emergency room, if you will be alive if you go without medical care for a week, you're going to be low priority. If you have a medical problem where you could die in a few hours if you don't get medical attention, you are a much higher priority in the triage. So it's the same sort of thing. You order things from, and the most bad things get the most attention first. So we use different systems in cybersecurity for triaging security vulnerabilities, and it's all based on how much damage can be done to the computer system if a bad guy were to exploit that vulnerability. And then there's another system for how likely a bad guy is to exploit that vulnerability. So the most damage that can be done and the most likely that vulnerability is going to be exploited, it gets ranked higher in the triaging. So you've got that. So you've got a whole, that's probably the meat of the report, is these are the security problems we found, and you're ordering it from most bad problems to least bad problems. And then you can give remediation advice. So the kind of thing that could be on a pen test report that isn't this exact vulnerability is a problem would be something like, for instance, we have some, you probably log into computer systems and online accounts every day, and you've got a username and a password. We now understand that usernames and passwords aren't enough. You need more than one-factor security to secure an account properly, because people's passwords get breached all the time. They can get cracked more often, though. Passwords are lost in data breaches. So you need to have, so think of a door with lots of different locks, and you need to make sure that if one of the locks is broken, you still have other locks locking the door. So we call that multi-factor authentication. So there might have biometrics. So for instance, you might be able to unlock your phone with your fingerprint or with your eye or with a face scan. And when you're using a part of your body as a way to authenticate into a computer system, we call that biometric authentication. That could be another factor of authentication other than a password. Another method of authentication, and you will only see this in a big company, you won't see this in consumer technology, is you might have a token. So it could be a key card that unlocks the door. You could have a key card or a key fob that you use with your laptop to swipe in order to, yes, this is me, I have this physical thing that is proof of my identity. And then another way that we can add another vector method of, we call it multi-factor authentication. Another factor authentication could be what we call one-time passwords. So very often people are emailed or text messaged a one-time password, which could be like a 6-digit number most of the time. So remember, if you've probably done this yourself, you try to log into something and you get an email or a text message and it gives you a 6-digit number, and that 6-digit number is good for 5 minutes or 15 minutes, and then after that it expires. So you have to enter that number in, and that's another way to prove that you are who you say you are, other than your password. These days, we understand that people's email and SMS text messaging can also easily be hacked. So I try to set up multi-factor authentication with apps on my phone. Like I have Google Authenticator and I have Microsoft Authenticator apps on my phone. So instead of that one-time password being sent through email or through the SMS networks, it is being sent to me through Google or Microsoft owned networks, which are a little bit more secure. So we generally recommend, if people can use those apps instead of email or text message, that's even better. So when you're securing an enterprise network and you're doing a pen test, one of the vulnerabilities you could identify is a lot of these accounts have passwords, but that's only one factor of authentication. They need multiple factors of authentication. There are some computer security standards that require you to have more than one method of authentication. So we usually go for something you know, which could be a password, something you are, which is your biometrics, your fingerprint scan or your iris scan, something you have, which could be a token, like a physical token, like a key card or a key fob, or it could be the one-time pass being sent to your smartphone app. Because in that case, the something you have is literally your smartphone.
And what you just said about the technical writing and the non-technical writing, I teach a class on policy writing. So my students actually, they're required to write an enterprise security policy or an issue-specific policy. And they find it really, they're all like cyber operations majors and computer science majors and leadership and intelligence, but they mostly until now, they were learning all these very like hard technology skills, reverse engineering. They were learning software exploitation and all of that, but they never really have done any policy writing. And now they're like, oh, this is not easy, because you understand the concept in a minute or so if you are already in the technical field. But in a company, there are people from multiple business units, multiple departments that don't have that technical knowledge. So when you're explaining a password policy, you need to, write in a way that the technology team, whoever's good with, IT, information security, understand it, as well as those folks from like the accounting department or the HR department need to understand that too. So they now understand, they now get why policies writing is a very essential skill too. So technical writing is very good to have. That's a great skill to have.
I think if people are struggling for how to explain technical things to non-technical people, they might get some practice or learn some things if they go on Reddit, and there's a whole subreddit called Explain Like I'm 5.
Yeah.
So if you go to that subreddit and just read what other people have written, and it's just a bunch of people asking complicated questions but wanting someone who's an expert in that field or whatever, to explain it to them in a simple way that they can understand.
Yeah.
And if you look on that subreddit and read it often, you could learn very useful things about how to explain technical things to lay people.
Thank you. That's great advice. I'm going to tell my students that. So I'm looking at the time and we're almost out of time. So I'll wrap up the session with one last question, which is what advice you have for, young people that are watching this video right now?
Yeah, if you want a career like mine, I would say start your own blog. You could use Medium or Substack these days would be the most popular options, and just write. And your writing at the beginning is not going to be as good as it will be 5, 10 years from now. I've written all kinds of things 15, 20 years ago that I look at now and I cringe a little bit. But that's normal. You get better as you go along. The best way to get a career as someone who writes about computer technology is to pursue computer technology, learn about it, take IT courses and study computer science. But if you want to be noticed for your writing, while you're doing that, also write about computer technology on your web blog, and then use social media like Twitter or Blue Sky or LinkedIn and share what you're writing with the world. And it could take a while, it could take years. It took me years to get noticed, but eventually someone might notice. And that has actually led to professional opportunities for me.
That is great advice. When we think of writing, like you had mentioned, we don't necessarily think of, English majors who can look into this as a possible career. If they have that, that spark or that inclination towards technology or cybersecurity, they could always pursue that career. I don't think we stress that enough, even for English majors. So thank you. That was great advice.
Yeah. I'm really honored to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.